All right, hello everybody. This is Sunday Recap from February the 3rd, and the title for this recap is Hometown Prophets and the Meaning of Love. You'll remember we had the call of Jeremiah. We also had Jesus in the synagogue being threatened with death. And we talked about how it is that when God's light comes into the world, it comes and is resisted by darkness, and that darkness often manifests itself with threats of violence and even violence that leads to injury or death. Now on your screen here is a picture of the prophet Jeremiah, painted by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You'll see Jeremiah is reflecting, but is also sad, and the people behind him are sad, especially as they reflect on the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of relationship that happened because of the people's faithlessness. So Jeremiah has this weight in the painting. It's also thought that Michelangelo was painting himself as a self-portrait, the artist appearing in his work, and rather than thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem, Michelangelo is reflecting on the weight of his sins. You recall that I said to you, God's vision for the life of Jeremiah and God's vision for your life surpasses any of the dangers or darkness that we will encounter. Now, as I also mentioned to you, the other text we had was Jesus in his hometown, and you'll recall he stood up and he read from the prophet Isaiah, and it was all very good. The Anointed One is here. The blind shall see, those who are in prison shall be made free, and then Jesus calls the people out on their faithlessness and their darkness. So remember, he talks about the prophet Elijah, and he talks about the prophet Elisha, and he said God had to seek out people who would believe that God could provide for them, and God could not find those people among his own. And so the people in the synagogue don't like that, so they take Jesus to this hill. This is the historic hill outside of Nazareth, where they think they took Jesus to throw him off. And you can see all the stones, and it would make a good place if you wanted to get rid of someone to throw them off one of the cliffs that we see on that hill. As we know, Jesus, unafraid, walks right through them because his hour has not yet come, and the resistance that darkness manifests is not a threat to his light. Jesus will take that darkness into his light. The darkness will not overcome him. All right, well, when we talked then about the shape of the Christian life, we turn to Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians, which is now part of our extended conversation on life in the Spirit and spiritual gifts. So that's 1 Corinthians 13. And what Paul says, if you remember, is, all this talk of spiritual gifts is meaningless if we don't understand that spiritual gifts and their exercise have to manifest themselves or be rooted in love. So this is where now we need to talk about the meaning of love. The unfortunate thing is that in English, we don't have that many nuances for the actual word for love. So we'll oftentimes say, oh, I love this show, or oh, I love my car. And in the same breath, we'll say, oh, I love my family. Well, we know that there are different degrees of love. Hopefully you do not love your sandwich as much as your wife. Hopefully. But it's difficult to tell that except by some sort of innate experience, something we know in ourselves. Now, this is not the case when Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians. If you remember, the New Testament was written in Greek. And the reason it was written in Greek is Greek very much functioned like English does today, as kind of a lingua franca, as a language that different cultures can use to conduct business, to get things done. And this is both the legacy of Alexander the Great and his program of sharing Greek culture, attaching that to local culture, and also the affinity that the Romans had for the Greeks. And so, people oftentimes spoke their native language and then Greek and maybe something else. So the New Testament was written in Greek, and in fact the whole Bible was written in Greek in something called the Septuagint, and that's actually an important book. You'll sometimes see it called this LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, because it was 70 people were claimed to have come together and translated it. So all that to say, there were people who read the entire scriptures, I should say the Septuagint is the Old Testament, who read that in Greek, and then the New Testament was added on to that. The letters were written in Greek, and what we know from the different authors is you can actually distinguish who was able to speak better Greek and who was more educated, who was less educated, and the like. It's interesting if you're interested in that. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about love. So in Greek, there are 3 words for love. And those 3 words are philia, eros, and agape. Now the word philia is the love that we have for friendship. It's the love for civic virtue. Now you may also recognize the word philia because of the city Philadelphia. So that is the city of fraternal love. So the love that you would have between brothers and sisters and family. The city of brotherly love, the city of fraternal love. So it's kind of philia is the love of friendship, the love of civic virtue, the love of fraternal love. Now, the second one, which is familiar to you, is eros, which is the word that comes to erotic love. Now, what characterizes the word eros is that eros is a seeking love. Now, when we think of the word erotic, obviously we think of seeking bodies. So when we are into someone or we desire them, we seek out their body or we seek something that they have. The Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and all of them also used it not just for seeking bodies or seeking physical connection, intimacy, but also seeking beauty and seeking truth. But it's important for us to understand that eros is a kind of striving love, and that's something that you experience. And in fact, you experience. Alright, and when we consider the third form of love, the word agape, this is the love that we use to describe God's love. This is a love that we might say is a giving love. So if eros is seeking, and not necessarily seeking in a negative way, though it could be negative, we think of agape as love that is a gift, love that makes a gift of itself. Now, one thing we might say is the way that God loves is something foreign to human beings, and so human beings have to be tutored in God's love, or have to be shaped in God's love. And that actually brings us up to the top of what it means to have life in the Spirit. So the big question for us as we remember what St. Paul said when he said, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, love does not seek after its own way, is what kind of love was St. Paul talking about? Was he talking philia, eros, or agape? Well, in that text, the word he uses is agape. The love that God loves with is patient. The love that God loves with is kind. The love that God loves with is not envious, is not self-seeking. So we have to be clear that Paul and the Bible are talking about a very specific kind of love, love that makes a gift of itself. And indeed, an old exercise you can do that I know I did when I was young is you could take this 1 Corinthians 13 passage and you could take the word love out and just put in the word God, because we know from the scriptures that God is love. And so if you wonder about God's nature, we can say God is patient, God is kind, God does not envy, and the like. Where that leaves us then is I want to give you a biblical text that you can study or reflect on in your prayers, and we can go a little bit deeper in one direction related to love and how it is that God loves us. So I'm going to pull up on the screen a text from John 21. Now this text is somewhat famous because it is the third resurrection appearance that Jesus has to the disciples in John's Gospel. So this is John 21, beginning in verse 15. And it's the very famous story where Jesus comes to Peter, who has betrayed him, and they have this 3-time interchange corresponding to the 3 times that Peter denied him. And Jesus asks the simple question, do you love me more than these? And we might say that for the Christian, this is the fundamental question. Where does your love for God rate on your love for other things? Because it's not that the things that we engage ourselves with are necessarily bad. They're not. But sometimes we can love, or our love can become deformed, or our love is not directed towards God. And so your call as a Christian, and the greatest command, is that love for God comes first. So here, Jesus now says to Simon Peter, Simon Peter, do you love me? Simon Peter, do you love me? And then Peter says, oh Lord, you know that I love you. Well, in English, it looks like they're just having a level interchange, but they're not. Jesus is saying, Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me and make a gift of yourself to me? And then Peter says, I philia you, Lord, or maybe a different form in the way that the grammar works, but whatever. I don't love you the way you love me. I love you, but it's not as strong. Or I love you, and it doesn't make the same gift. And not to make too much of the difference in these words, except to say that Peter's love is less than the love that God is asking for. So Jesus asks again, Peter, do you agape me? Peter says, yes, Lord. And the word he uses again is related to this word, philia. Lord, you know that I love you. But it is not the love that you are asking for, God, and I cannot love you with the love that you love me. So now Jesus asks the third time, Peter, do you love me? And now Jesus uses Peter's word. Jesus uses Peter's love. Peter, do you love me as you are able? And Peter says, yes. Oops. Yes. Sorry, I thought that I was messing up on my underlining here. He says, yes. I love you with philia again. Do you love me? Peter's hurt because Jesus asks, do you love me? And then Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So what's the significance of that? What is the significance that Jesus does not use agape here? And when the narrator repeats it, he does not use agape there. Well, one of the things we can say about God's self-giving love is that it's condescending. And not condescending in a negative way. It's condescending in that it goes down with. That's what the word means, right? It goes down with. God's love reaches down to us. And it travels with us. And it meets us. So Jesus lowers himself, condescends to where Peter can meet him. And then Jesus doesn't just leave us, and now I might be making up a new word, but I'm going to say it anyhow. Jesus then is con-ascending, meaning Jesus then lifts us. When we talk about life in the Spirit, we talk about ascending with Christ so that where our love is imperfect, where our love is inconstant, where our love is uncertain, it gets enfolded into God's own self-gift, gets enfolded into God's own agape, and that's where transformation in the Spirit happens. So what makes that possible is the life that we have in the Spirit. Peter, do you love me? Peter cannot meet Jesus in the place where God is, and so Jesus meets him. This is the idea that God meets you wherever you are. God loves you wherever you are. And then God goes with. That's why this word con is so important. God goes with you as a companion to shape, to inspire, to give a future according to the vision he has for your life. And indeed, the next section of this chapter from John is Jesus lays out a little bit of the vision for what Peter can expect coming up, and it's not necessarily a happy vision for Peter, because it will mean following Jesus to that same place of self-gift, which will be the cross, and that's where Peter's life ends, on the cross. All right, well, that conducts or concludes our Sunday recap for Grace Lutheran Church. The idea that God's light in the darkness, a darkness that resists with violence, even death, but it is a darkness that finally cannot overcome the light. And so your call as a Christian is to trust that God's vision and God's light can see you through the dark places, and then to reflect on, how does God love me? How is God's love different than the way I love? And what does God invite me into in terms of living out that self-gift of love that Jesus himself showed us in his ministry, his living, and his dying? God bless you the rest of this week, and we'll see you again soon.